Welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much.
And before we start, I want to acknowledge a third author. She's actually the first author on this essay, Dr. Lisa Perks of Merrimack College, whose garden is also the stuff of legends.
That's the truth. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks for folks who are joining us virtually via Zoom. Starting in March of 2020 and continuing for several months thereafter, this was a scene that was an increasingly common one throughout the United States and the world. Do you all remember seeing shelves like this, the empty ones? I tend to do most of the grocery shopping in our household because I really enjoy it. It's sort of my way to sort of get away from everything, and I'll spend a couple of hours wandering the grocery store aisles. And I can remember, being one of those panic buyers, right, in the days sort of leading up to the CDC declaring a global pandemic in late March 2020 and for the days afterwards. And I don't know if you all can remember those times, right? But what was the first thing that you noticed disappearing from store shelves? What was the first thing to go? Yeah. Toilet paper. But even before that, before the toilet paper disappeared, I noticed it was hand sanitizer, right? I think I got the last bottle of Purell in all of Chester County. It was sitting there on the shelf with like a gold light coming down. So hand sanitizer was the first to go. I noticed the next evening I went to Wegmans in Downingtown. Soap, right? Hand soap was almost completely gone. At that point, I started going every night, right? About 7 or 8 o'clock, I go down to Wegmans just because I felt like I needed to buy things. And I think it was on the 3rd or 4th trip after all the toilet paper disappeared. I remember walking down the aisle that had peanut butter on it, right? And it was completely empty, including the chunky peanut butter.
I got my AirPods.
And it was at that point I knew we were in for trouble if all the peanut butter was gone. Depending on the time of year, the weather, other global incidents, this scene can still be found today more often than we used to find it, and certainly more often than perhaps we're comfortable with. So Amanda and I have been semi-serious gardeners for about 10 years now. It's something we've always enjoyed doing, but the pandemic inspired us to really take matters into our own hands and take some control at a time when we felt quite helpless, but also take our gardening to a new level. And here's some snapshots of that first pandemic garden we had in 2020. So we had always had a garden here since we bought our house in Westchester, but we really ramped it up and started growing some sweet potatoes. We got a really nice one there, lots of green beans, tomatoes, cucumbers. Even took a shot that was mostly unsuccessful at growing corn, as you can see there in the lower right-hand photo. And the thing is we weren't alone. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in March of 2020, the US has seen a really dramatic increase in in the number of people starting pandemic gardens. And they were sometimes referred to as recovery gardens, right, or resilience gardens. And according to a 2021 survey that was conducted by the Axiom Corporation and published last year, nearly half of all the respondents nationwide also revealed that the pandemic increased their interest in gardening. And it wasn't just their interest that increased. Over 40% indicated that they were spending a lot more times working in their garden in 2020 than they did in previous years. And that was particularly true for folks in that younger 19 to 39 age demographic who were also working from home, right? They suddenly found themselves with more time to get out there and get their hands in the dirt and, to take a stab at growing fruits and vegetables. So this was a trend that we noticed even before it was a quantifiable trend and data was starting to come out on this increase in gardening during the pandemic. We started noticing our neighbors in the cul-de-sac who had never really gardened before were outside tending gardens and building beds and coming to us for advice, on how to grow tomatoes. We talked to our friends around the country who were also gardening a lot more than usual. And when we were taking a break from our own gardening to doom scroll, right, and check the CDC's latest COVID numbers, news of political unrest, and updates on what at the time seemed like the impending downfall of civilization as we know it. We would often also see news about people gardening, right? And so this sparked our interest. Could this uptick in gardening that we were seeing really amongst our friends and in the local community also potentially be a positive outcome of what was, an increasingly terrible global pandemic?
So we're communication researchers, and one of the kinds of communication that we study is mediated messages. So for this project, we were interested in how news media coverage shaped the public's understanding of this pandemic gardening boom. So we're going to use a couple of terms pretty frequently in this presentation. The first is framing, and framing is a term that refers to how media, our gatekeepers of information in society, how they shape our understanding of something. In particular, we were looking for dominant themes, which is the other term you're going to hear us use quite a bit, or patterns within this news coverage. And so in terms of rhetorical framing analysis, essentially what we're looking for is when there is a constellation or a group of related themes, when those form around a particular issue, then we would argue that that is pointing to a larger frame. And so that's what we're going to describe here. So in order to uncover these themes or patterns in the news coverage of pandemic gardening, we analyzed news coverage from April 1st of 2020, and this was early on in the pandemic, but late enough where we knew that things were getting real, right? So the 2 week, we're gonna stay home and get rid of this little COVID thing idea was fading fast, and we knew that like things were getting serious. And we looked at coverage from that date until July 1st of 2021. And so that gave us at least a year's worth of coverage. And the end date, to be honest, is a little more arbitrary. We were sort of pushed by the deadline of our publication. And so that's the date there. We use the popular news aggregator Google News to gather our texts, and we did that on purpose for a couple of reasons. One, we wanted a broad range of news coverage, so lots of different types of news coverage. And 2, we wanted to look at sources that would be free for the average person seeking it out. And so we were looking for things that weren't necessarily behind paywalls and things like that. So the corpus of text, or the body of text that we ended up with, was in fact very, very broad. So our texts ranged from national to local US newspapers. We had US news magazines. We had some specialized trade magazines, international newspapers, and international news wire services, as well as both public and commercial television and radio broadcast text. So we had quite a few different types of media there. We performed a focused keyword search using the terms pandemic gardening, and that in that time frame gave us a result. Nope, you leave that alone.
Sorry.
Sir. That gave us a result of about 230 sources. And once we weeded out, if you get what I'm saying there, the sources that were duplicates or sources that were just giving a passing reference to gardening, we ended up with 113 texts that we analyzed. Now I'm ready with this one.
Okay.
So our analysis of this 113 texts revealed 4 dominant themes. So those 4 patterns that we were looking for that cut across a wide range of these media and these contexts. And those themes are economics, food sovereignty, which we'll explain here in a bit, mental and physical health, and building community and connection. And so those are our 4 themes that we'll talk about, but keep in mind, those themes, and this is our argument here, are pointing to an overarching frame as one of control. So we'll talk about those themes, but as we think about how this frame of gardening as control sort of runs through those themes. And so Roger will start us off, and we'll give a brief overview of each of our themes here.
Great. So the first thing we're going to talk about is economics. And the photo that you see here on the projection screen is of a gardening center in Fort Collins, Colorado. It was featured in a CNN article that was one of the sources we analyzed. And it was talking about the rise in gardening, right? And then what that led to, which was of course an increased demand for plants and seeds and gardening supplies. So in terms of economics, the sources in our sample discussed how garden centers, other types of businesses, not just the big box stores like Home Depot and Lowe's, but also local independently owned nurseries and gardening centers, how they coped with this massive surge in seed and plant and garden related sales. And shortages of these coveted goods were often likened to the toilet paper, frenzy at the outset of the pandemic. And there were two sides of this sort of economics coin that were featured in a lot of the articles that we looked at. So on the one hand, these garden related businesses saw a lot of economic benefits because of the surge in sales. And that was markedly different from other areas of the economy that were very negatively impacted by the lockdowns and other, pandemic related restrictions. So, a lot of the restaurants, some of them that we used to see down on Gay Street and Market Street aren't there anymore, right? Restaurants were closing down, hotels and other types of lodging businesses suffered, the airlines and, bus lines and trains really struggled. But these, garden centers did really, really well. I can remember in early April, as we were, had these visions of expanding our home garden, I sort of naively, strolled down to Home Depot to buy a single trellis because we were going to try to grow Chinese long beans, big, beautiful 3-foot long, beans that, need to grow on a trellis. And I'll just pick up a trellis at Home Depot. And of course I get there's no trellises, there's no soil, there's shovels, there's no gloves. That whole sort of outside area where you would usually go to get garden supplies was completely empty. And they didn't even have anybody back there staffing it because there's nothing to sell. So no problem, I'll go to Lowe's, and it was the same thing, right? So that was, difficult for consumers like us and gardeners, but also really good for those businesses that sell those things. They sell record sales. But on the other side of that coin, these, consumers, in an attempt to, again, harness some control over an unstable and unpredictable food supply chain by growing their own food, also created this problem. So there were a lot of seed shortages, even with mail order companies that usually have an abundance of seed to sell every year, and also canning supply shortages. So we had decided to get into canning that year. We're going to try that out. And we had the pots and, all of the stuff you need for that. But mason jars were really, really tough to find. The lids and the bands that you need to do canning were also in short supply. So the underlying issues that these, shortages inspired, or that inspired rather the garden boom, are the subject of the next 3 themes in our analysis.
So this photo was taken from an article written by Carly Coop, and she wrote it for a local paper in Steinbach, which is a city in Manitoba, Canada. And this is the Funk family, and they are in front of, or I guess they're behind, their free little garden that they set up in their front yard. And this story that this photo comes from features the Funk family and their idea to turn their front lawn, part of their front lawn, into garden space where other members of their community could come and use that space and plant their own garden items, or people could come by and, if you see a ripe tomato on the vine, you can go ahead and take it and pick what you need. This article about this sharing of food during the pandemic is really emblematic of this food sovereignty theme. And so in this theme, pandemic-related disruptions in food and consumer supplies were pitched as sort of the cause or the reason for pandemic gardening's growing popularity. These stories were also happening alongside the reality of, certainly, but also coverage of folks experiencing food insecurity. And so very early on in the pandemic, people are laid off because things are shut down. And so people who had not been experiencing food insecurity before certainly were, as the pandemic started to progress, and folks who were experiencing food insecurity, that problem was exacerbated, and we would see stories with lines of cars going to food banks and things like that. And so alongside that reality, we have these stories about pandemic gardens, and the idea in these sources is that in the absence of reliable produce supplies, food supplies, people could simply grow their own. So one source noted that, quote, saving and sharing seeds and growing the foods that we want to grow can help us reduce food insecurity and increase food sovereignty or control over our own food source. Similarly, a volunteer at a local community gardening cooperative was quoted in a different source and argued that this cooperative gardening could help address food insecurity by saying, quote, addressing food insecurity involves giving people the tools to be autonomous in how they feed their families and how they feed themselves. And Dave Thompson, who is the sales and operations director at Seeds of Change, which is a company that sells organic seeds, he explained in an article in People magazine that, quote, consumers want to garden because, quote, it gives people more control over their food source. Now, this theme certainly resonated with us. I mean, we were fortunate enough to not face food insecurity, but there was certainly a time there when colleges and universities were closing down where we didn't know if we would be furloughed, would things be shut down forever. We didn't know the depths of Zoom that we would soon experience. And so this resonated because that is one reason why we started to grow our garden. I honestly felt that, you know, if things really got bad, I had my little patch of green beans out in the backyard, the dubiously trellised long beans, you know, out in the backyard. And there was that sort of sense of security that we had something if things really got bad.
And then realistically, we probably had enough food back there to last 24 hours, right? Maybe 48 if we stretched it out.
Last,
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
And so really, so that was sort of part of this theme. The other part of this theme, so on the one hand, there's this benefit of growing your own food and having food, which is certainly a benefit. But we also saw in this theme that there was a thread that growing your own food had an environmental benefit. And so greater control over one's food supply was sort of said to help us be able to decrease our carbon footprints. Mm-hmm. So for example, one source that supported this part of the theme explained that, quote, instead of depending on food that has traveled thousands of miles to arrive on grocery store shelves, new gardeners may, quote, come to see food grown in the backyard as a safer, fresher, and tastier alternative, even long after the pandemic is over. And so while taking control over your food source has the obvious practical benefit of again, having food, news coverage of the pandemic gardening also saw the process of gardening as one that was beneficial both for physical and mental health. And so Roger will talk a little bit about that theme.
So this is our third theme. You can see the image here. This was featured in one of our international news sources, the United News of Bangladesh service. And it was a story that focused on rooftop gardening, right? And container gardening, which is really helpful for folks in urban centers, right? Or who may not have a lot of land to build, you know, garden beds. You can work with small containers on patios and roofs to grow food. And we saw a sort of a health theme in these sources. It was a really common one throughout our sample. It touted a lot of benefits that, you know, gardeners get from working in gardens. Reduced anxiety was one of them, reduced stress, more control, immune system benefits, and of course, exercise. And in this theme, the garden was sort of seen as a site that substituted for the gym and other types of places where we used to socialize and exercise, but were closed right during the worst part of the pandemic. Excuse me, one article that talked about this is in People magazine. It quoted a jewelry maker in Nashville, Tennessee named Gabrielle Friedman, whose spouse worked as a frontline healthcare worker. And Friedman discussed her motivation for becoming a pandemic gardener in this way. It's such a dark time. To see something grow and flourish is very healing to me. This is an escape. I'm outside and I don't even think about COVID and what's going on. So sources in this theme commonly mention gardening as providing a relief of stress, anxiety, and giving its practitioners a sense of control during an uncertain time. Another story quoted somebody in NPR's Weekend edition saying, "I might not be able to control the news or the weather or whatever it is my sourdough starter is doing in that jar." And we also are sourdough bakers. So I can relate to this because the starter does what it wants to, cannot be controlled. She goes on to say, "I can, however, press a tiny radish seed into the dirt, give it food and water, and watch it grow." So these sources are emphasizing how gardening can replace other physical activities, right, that were restricted in lockdowns, such as going to the gym. In another source, this is Natalie Bazile was quoted. She's an author of an anthology on African-American farmers who described the appealing benefits of gardening this way. "There's something absolutely essential and healthy and meditative about getting outside and doing something physical. You're moving your body, you're getting exercise, you're breathing clean air, you're connected to the earth." So gardening is crafted here in these sources as a mechanism of control over body outputs like exercise and body inputs like food, with everything connected to the natural world. And so we'll see in our last theme that Amanda will talk about, gardening is also described as a way to connect to other people.
So this photograph was featured in an article written by Matthew Bryant and Alyssa Bedrosian, and they were then, I'm not sure if they're still students, maybe they graduated, but they were students, journalists for the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and this appeared in the newspaper for that university, and it featured a story about faculty and students who maintained the university's school gardens during the first summer of the pandemic, and sort of the benefits that these participants had by being able to connect with one another in this way. And that's sort of the main gist of this theme. So sources contributing to this theme really focused on how pandemic gardening helped people feel connected to nature and to other people, and build this sense of community during a time when we had long periods of isolation, we were in quarantine, we couldn't see one another. And these sources really paint a picture of Eden, if you will, where gardeners are forging connections with the earth and their own spirituality and one another through this sharing of garden work and garden knowledge, and of course of harvests. This theme also resonated with us, and so we're sort of strange gardeners in that we're not just backyard gardeners, we're side yard and front yard gardeners, and so we're very visible to our neighbors who are always wondering what new strange thing we're doing.
If I had my way, our front yard would be a cornfield.
Yeah,
So
we're
working towards that eventually here.
And so during this time, during gardening season, and even now, but particularly during the first summer of the pandemic, I mean, we spoke to our neighbors more and met more of our neighbors than we ever had in the 7 years that we've lived on our little cul-de-sac, where folks were sort of coming by to see what strange thing that we're doing, or we had, the neighbors across the street came over to get the specs on one of our raised beds and then built a similar one in their own yard. And of course we would, hand out cucumbers and tomatoes to anyone who would, spare us a passing glance. And so this sense of community certainly resonated with us as well. So an example from our sources, this one comes from National Public Radio's Weekend Edition, and it's a story that featured an environmental studies professor who explained that, quote, "What people are starved for right now," and this is early on in the pandemic, "isn't food, but contact with something real. We spend all day on screens. We can't be around each other at restaurants or at ballparks. We can't even give hugs or handshakes. So all of a sudden, the appeal of sinking your hands into the dirt and using your body in ways that matters becomes irresistible." Another source quoted a university student who had participated in a community garden, and the student said, during the pandemic, I've basically been locked in my house. So just being able to come out here has been my only social interaction for a while. Overall, the sources that contribute to this theme center on the idea that gardening is a way that allows people to do their part and forge a stronger sense of community when the other areas where we might build community are not available to us.
So we're approaching the end here and have some conclusions we want to draw on, but before we get to that, we wanted to first take a moment and ask if any of the 4 themes that we've been talking about so far resonated with any of you. So again, they're economics, food sovereignty, physical and mental health, and finally building community and connections. I'm not sure how many of you got into gardening during the pandemic. I know we have a lot of students, joining us on Zoom and in the room. And sometimes, if you're living in residence halls and apartment complexes, gardening can be a bit of a challenge, right? Unless you maybe do container gardening, that sort of thing. But do any of these themes maybe resonate with folks?
Gardening.
Yeah. Did you do any gardening, Jade?
I know,
Yeah.
I had went through the pandemic. It was kind of difficult, but
Yeah.
Sure.
Nice. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I was a junior and my school started doing gardening like outside of our school, and I didn't understand why we're doing this.
Yeah.
And it came to me later because I didn't know we're doing this. That people go out and get their own food, they have to grow it themselves.
Mm.
Our school basically like they do ahead of time.
Oh, wow. So if you're joining on Zoom and couldn't hear, one of the audience members was relating an experience as a junior in high school, right? Junior going into senior year, and your local district actually got students together to go out and garden off campus. So did they have a plot somewhere? Was it a community garden or? Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah. Cool. Did you grow anything?
I didn't because I didn't understand the concept of it.
Yeah. Sure.
Later, figured out what it was. I was never. But
Yeah. Yeah.
I did it.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. So that was a new thing that started at your school as a result of the pandemic. Got it. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. We had one other question we wanted to ask, and we're going to, offer in our conclusions a critique. So we are rhetorical critics, and for us, this is often the most important. It's our jam, and it's often the most important part of any type of research project. We're not just interested in reporting what journalists and news media sources are saying and how they're talking about it, but what are they missing, right? What are we not talking about? How is this coverage maybe problematic in some ways? Who's it empowering and is it disempowering? These are important things that we're often thinking about. So one question we throw out there for you all, do you see anything missing or lacking in the news coverage that we've been talking about so far? Are journalists, news sources missing something in the way that they're talking about this pandemic gardening surge? Yeah, Camille?
Convincing. It also compared other hobbies because a lot of people were starting new hobbies. And so it would be interesting to see if this hobby in particular exceeded the other hobbies and also build more like the foundation for why it's so important to.
Sure.
I know other people were getting into like more crazy stuff.
What kind of things are they getting into? Just from like what you were saying?
Yeah.
Mm.
Watching like certain shows. And
Sure.
Things, shows, and like just all different types of hobbies.
Okay, all right. So maybe focusing and situating pandemic gardening in terms of other activities that rose in popularity. Good. Yeah, good. Anyone else? Yeah.
I'm so curious to like what's happening currently because
Mm.
now that we've heard of it, was it a bad or are these things still happening now because things are expensive, everything blew up ever since. COVID.
Boy, did it. Yeah.
But, like, going to the grocery store, buying vegetables, very expensive.
Mhm.
So just stop for a period of time and then back up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's a good point. So for folks on Zoom, the question is, was it just a fad, right? That was part of the pandemic, and a very good question, will we see a similar boom now that prices for food have gone up? And so the short answer is we don't know, but we do know that, so gardening spiked, particularly early on in the pandemic, but has been pretty consistently heavier than normal. Than it has in recent years. And so it'll be interesting to see sort of this next growing season this spring, if it remains high or even spikes again because of food prices. That'll be interesting. I know that our own personal gardening has gotten completely out of control. So we
overdid it this year.
if you need anything, can just hook us up
Let me
after
know.
after break. Yep. So good. Any other thing that you can think of that might be missing before we tell you what we think? All right. So start our deal. There we go. Okay, so we do have a critique, and so we have 4 of them, in fact. And so the first is sort of woven throughout these 4 themes. We found that media coverage often promoted individual level solutions for what are really widespread systematic problems. Things like food insecurity, stable industrial food supply chains, or even mental health resources. And what we found that in this coverage, in this news coverage, there was this overarching message of really what we would call food supply and health bootstrapping, whereby you as individuals could gain control over your own self, over your ability to have your own food and your own well-being simply by your own hard work in your backyard garden, which we find unrealistic. These gardens also, in terms of this second critique, really emphasize the gardening process. So how to build a raised bed, how to germinate seeds indoors, when to plant your corn. All of these
Earlier
things,
than you think is the answer. Earlier than you think. Yep.
One day we'll have corn. While de-emphasizing the products, right? So the actual fruits of your labor, literally. So the harvest was commonly sort of discussed in these really vague terms, and there was this sort of assumption of bounty. And if anyone has ever gardened before, you know that these themes would clearly glossed over sort of the challenges that could really wreck a backyard garden. And so if there is a groundhog in sight, or if there's too much rain or not enough rain, or too much sun or not enough sun, or heaven forbid you have aphids on your tomatoes, your harvest is in danger. And so, but rather than recognize these things, gardening is really pitched as a way to have control over a chaotic world, and doesn't really recognize the difficulties of actually getting that $60 tomato from your backyard garden.
Yeah. And for the next critique here, although sustainability was a prominent theme in the news coverage in our sample, it talked about that quite a bit. Issues of food justice, social justice, of ecological justice received very little attention. Very few sources address things like organic pest control, permaculture practices, sustainable soil amendments, carbon capturing, farm workers' rights. Some of these really important issues just weren't getting talked about. And when they did, it was usually in very specialized sources. So like the Sierra Club's monthly magazine did talk about those things, but we would expect that from that particular organization. You didn't see it as much in People or the New York Times. So this collection of themes, again, all clustered around this frame of control, suggests our final critique here, which is an overarching ideology of optimism in the media coverage of pandemic gardening. These 4 themes that we covered and talked about today, include individual level solutions, these glimmers of joy and health, flashes of economic windfalls, especially if you owned a nursery or worked at a gardening center. But the sources did not seem to, seriously consider structural solutions to what are really structural systemic problems. Not much in the way of practical gardening advice and very little harvest testimony. Right. And again, the sources were helpful in that, in this, we're constantly kind of drowning in a sea of soul crushing news stories about illness, death, and loneliness. And the, media and news sources in turn framed pandemic gardening as a kind of tangible, sustaining, much needed antidote to all of the awful stuff that was going on and still is. I mean,
And so really looking to the future, we think that scholars might consider how these themes early on in the development of the trend might compare to the trend as it ages. And so as you mentioned in the back, right? So, now that seed shortages are either old news or less of a problem, will journalists, will media coverage dig more into these sustainability and food justice issues? Will they frame stories of resilience gardens with this cautious optimism, or will they offer more practical advice for folks who are really trying to take control over their food source? And our concern is that without this practical advice and without a more sustainability focused conversation, gardening will be a short-lived trend rather than a personal or cultural transformation.
thank you.
I want to take any questions. Like. Sure. So can we answer any questions? I don't know. I can't really see a Zoom.
And folks who are on the Zoom call, if you did have a question, feel free to drop it in the chat.
Okay.
Should we stop sharing? Maybe that might be the best.
There we go. Now we can see folks.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm curious if there was any kind of geographic focus of the subjects of these articles. Because I have a sense that the gardening boom was not strictly, but probably largely a suburban phenomenon.
Sure.
Was there much discussion about, for example, in urban areas, often people don't have access to space for gardening?
Sure, yeah, of course. So the question for folks on Zoom is, was there sort of a geographic region where we saw gardening booms, or at least from the sources? And I would say that it was a pretty wide mix. And so sure, we have you're absolutely right. So there were suburban, gardens. It's much easier if you have a plot of land, but there were a lot of different articles, like the one that Roger mentioned from the Bangladesh source that talked about rooftop gardening. There were a lot of sources that talked about hydroponic gardening in your living room, right? So how do you and there was one, I think it was in the New York Times even, that had this, whole hydroponic setup. And so there was, and even in some of the more international sources, it was a lot more sort of container gardening and things like that. And so so I would say that it wasn't limited, although I would say, another critique is like the reality of it is also you need land if you're going to produce, enough to live on, certainly.
We have a friend who tried to go nuts with a container garden, and her had so many big containers on a raised, sort of deck that it started the deck itself started buckling. There's structural damage to it, and she had to, thousands of pounds of dirt up there. So that's
we inherited a lot of her infrastructure because her deck could not take it. So here's a question from the chat. It says, you may have mentioned this already, but did you see positives from gardening that helped your mental health? And I think we certainly did. And I think we can all relate to like Zoom fatigue and looking at yourself on Zoom and just having Zoom kind of drain the life out of you. And at the time, Roger was teaching at home. I was in the different room teaching at home. Our son was going to school on Zoom. And so it did feel really good. And we felt very fortunate to be able to go outside and make our son go outside and do something that just felt productive, like you could, and in that control theme, we are critical of it, but I certainly see the appeal where, it's something, I can pull the weeds out of the ground, and that's something that I can do and see a difference, particularly at a time when it felt like there wasn't much to be done for anything, so we certainly did.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
So you guys look at the framing,
Mhm.
the rhetoric involved. Is there any, would there be any interest in, or would it be possible to test how the messaging affected people who hadn't thought of doing gardening or were thinking about doing gardening? Of course, you don't need to have the media to
Sure.
tell you that gardening is an option because people have been doing it for 10,000 years.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so the question is, we looked at this news coverage, is there a way to test if it worked, right? If it helped promote gardening? I'm not sure.
I mean, I think it would be, it'd be a kind of a different project, but
Mhm.
also an interesting one to actually talk to gardeners, right? And you could do that obviously with a more quantitative kind of survey sample, which isn't really what we do. Like I would be more interested in doing qualitative interviews, right? And
Focus groups.
yeah, get focus groups and that sort of thing. And that would be really interesting to see what they're getting from it. And if it's matching, especially with our critiques, right? And if they're picking up on these themes that we're seeing in the coverage itself. Yeah,
Yeah, because that was one critique, right? And
giving me ideas here
yeah.
too.
This idea that, you can end your own food insecurity by growing your own food. I mean, gardening is very expensive, right? It's, there's a lot of startup. It's not as simple as just, putting some seeds in the ground. And you
Yeah.
also have to have time. So, if you're trying to find work and feed yourself with, monetary gains, it's something that is a luxury in many ways, for sure.
I heard somebody say that I think they had started a garden during the pandemic. They weren't getting a lot of produce, more like garnishes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Garnishes, yes. Yes.
Yeah, I can relate.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah. We first started kind of gardening when we lived in Waco, Texas, which had a very, sort of dry climate.
Yes.
And we didn't get much.
Yeah.
Not even peppers, which are supposed to grow really well there in New Mexico, where we were gardening after that. Yeah.
All right.
Well, thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so
Really
much.
appreciate the great turnout, and thanks. I think we had at one point about 40 folks on Zoom. Thanks to everyone. I recognize a lot of names here, so I appreciate all of my students, especially dropping by. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you.